After losing her job in a sudden layoff and discovering her fiancé's infidelity, Olivia Bennett's carefully planned life crumbles overnight. Left with nowhere to turn, she inherits her late grandmother's aging house in the rural town of Cedar Hill, a far cry from the bustling city she once called home. The house, much like Olivia's life, is in disrepair. The garden her grandmother once cherished is overrun with weeds, and the small-town community greets her with a mix of kindness and skepticism. Just as she begins to rebuild, Olivia faces resistance from a vocal few who doubt her vision for a community market that could breathe new life into Cedar Hill. Amidst these challenges, Olivia finds unexpected allies. Nate, a compassionate carpenter with his own past to mend, and a group of neighbors inspired by her grandmother's legacy. As she fights to revive the garden and create a space for connection and healing, Olivia must confront lingering shadows of betrayal when her ex-fiancé reappears, threatening to unravel her newfound stability. Can Olivia overcome her doubts, rally the town behind her vision, and finally lay the past to rest? Or will her dream of starting over wither under the weight of old wounds and new conflicts? Olivia Bennett gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white against the cold leather. The city lights of Chicago shimmered in her rearview mirror, fading with each mile she drove. Her eyes stung with tears, but she blinked them back, focusing on the endless stretch of highway ahead. In the back seat, Max, her loyal golden retriever, stirred restlessly, sensing the tension in his owner. 2 weeks ago, her life had been stable, or so she thought. She had a promising career as a graphic designer at a prestigious firm, a beautiful apartment in the city, and an upcoming wedding to her fiancé, Ethan. It was the life she had meticulously planned for years, a testament to her hard work and resilience. But life had other plans. The first blow came when her boss, Mr. Harrington, called her into his office. His expression was apologetic as he explained the company's need to downsize. Olivia had been one of the employees they could not afford to keep. The words felt like a gut punch, leaving her dazed and humiliated. Before she could even process the loss, the second blow hit her harder. That evening, she returned home earlier than usual, only to find Ethan in their shared bed with another woman. The betrayal was so visceral that it felt like her chest had been split open. Ethan's feeble excuses only deepened her pain. 2 weeks later, here she was, driving through the darkened Midwest, every mile taking her farther away from the life she had built. Her grandmother's old house in Cedar Hill was her only refuge now. A distant childhood memory of summers spent in the small Kansas town offered a glimmer of hope, though Olivia had no idea what awaited her there. The highway eventually gave way to narrow country roads, bordered by vast fields of golden corn swaying gently in the night breeze. Olivia's phone buzzed briefly with a message. No service. She sighed, already feeling the isolation creep in. By the time she reached Cedar Hill, the small town was silent, its streets bathed in moonlight. Olivia turned on a maple drive, where her grandmother's house stood at the very end. The sight of it made her heart sink. The house looked smaller than she remembered. Its white paint had peeled away in several places, revealing the gray wood underneath. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the front porch steps were warped and cracked. Tall grass and weeds had overtaken the yard, giving the property a sense of abandonment. "This is it, Max," Olivia muttered, turning off the engine. The dog sat up, his golden fur glowing softly in the dim light. He wagged his tail as if to reassure her. When Olivia stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapped around her. She stretched her stiff limbs before walking up the creaking porch steps to the front door. She reached for the spare key her mother had mailed her, but when she opened the door, she froze. Taped to the inside of the door was a bright orange notice. Eviction pending. Property violation, contact the county office. "What?" Olivia whispered. Her heart pounded as she ripped the notice from the door and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, and dust blanketed every surface. She dropped her bag and wandered through the dimly lit rooms, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. It was clear no one had lived here for years. Olivia sat heavily on the couch, sending up a cloud of dust. Max padded over and rested his head on her lap, his warm presence grounding her. She buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of her circumstances. "How did it come to this?" she whispered. Morning light streamed through the thin curtains, waking Olivia earlier than she intended. She stretched stiffly, feeling the aches from sleeping on the old, lumpy couch. Max yawned beside her, his tail thumping against the floor. Determined to face the situation head-on, Olivia searched through the kitchen drawers for anything useful. To her relief, she found an envelope containing property records and a note from her grandmother. It was written in the shaky cursive Olivia remembered from the birthday cards her grandmother used to send. "Dear Olivia, this house has seen better days, but it is still full of love. I hope it gives you the fresh start you need. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. Love, Grandma." The words brought tears to Olivia's eyes. She folded the note carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. Despite the eviction notice, she resolved to stay and fight for the home her grandmother had entrusted to her. Later that morning, as Olivia wrestled with the stubborn front door lock, a tall man in a flannel shirt and worn jeans appeared at the edge of the yard. "Need a hand?" he called out. Startled, Olivia turned to see the man approaching with a friendly but cautious smile. "I'm Nate Hayes," he said, extending a hand. "I live a few houses down. Used to help your grandma with odd jobs around here. You must be Olivia." "Yes," she said hesitantly, shaking his hand. "I heard you'd be moving in," Nate continued. "Looks like the place could use some work. If you need help, just say the word. I do carpentry and repairs for a living." Olivia hesitated. She had grown wary of relying on others, especially after what Ethan had done. But the kindness in Nate's eyes was disarming. I might take you up on that," she said finally. Nate grinned. "Good. Cedar Hill's small, but folks look out for each other here. You're not alone, Olivia." His words stayed with her long after he left. For the first time in weeks, Olivia felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this small town, with its peeling paint and overgrown grass, held the key to rebuilding her life. As the sun set over the fields that evening, Olivia sat on the porch steps with Max by her side. The crickets chirped a steady rhythm, and the air carried the faint scent of wildflowers. "This is where we start over," Olivia said softly, stroking Max's fur. The dog looked up at her, his golden eyes reflecting the fading light. And for the first time in a long while, Olivia allowed herself to believe that things might just turn out okay. The morning sun filtered through the broken blinds, illuminating the dusty interior of the living room. Olivia woke with a start, Max's wet nose nudging her arm. She had fallen asleep on the couch again, wrapped in the blanket she had found in the hall closet. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the creaking of the old house and the faint smell of mildew brought her back to reality. "Another day," she whispered to herself, sitting up and stretching her sore neck. After letting Max out into the overgrown backyard, Olivia grabbed the eviction notice from the coffee table. The bold letters stared back at her accusingly. She needed answers, and quickly. At the county office, Olivia sat across from a woman named Doris, whose thick glasses magnified her sharp eyes. Doris clicked her keyboard methodically, her red nails tapping in rhythm. "Well, Miss Bennett," she said, adjusting her glasses, "it looks like this property has some unpaid taxes dating back 3 years. That's why the eviction notice was issued." Olivia's stomach churned. 3 years? My grandmother passed away 2 years ago. I had no idea. Doris nodded sympathetically. "It happens more often than you'd think. The good news is you have time to sort this out. If you can pay the balance within 90 days, the property is yours to keep. And the bad news?" Doris hesitated. "The house is in violation of several safety codes. You'll need to make repairs to bring it up to standard, or the town will declare it uninhabitable." Olivia left the office feeling like the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. 90 days to save the house. 90 days to rebuild a life she hadn't planned for. As she walked back to her car, Nate's offer of help echoed in her mind. Back at the house, Olivia found Nate already waiting on the porch. His work truck, dented and well-loved, was parked on the curb. "Morning," he said, tipping his baseball cap. "Thought I'd swing by and see how you're settling in." Olivia hesitated before holding out the eviction notice. "I could use some advice." Nate read the notice carefully, his expression serious. When he finished, he handed it back to her. "This isn't great, but it's not the end of the world," he said. "The house is good bones. With a little work, we can fix the safety violations." "We?" Olivia asked, raising an eyebrow. "Sure," Nate said with a shrug. "I've got some free time between jobs. Plus, your grandma was good to me. She'd bake me pies whenever I fixed her leaky faucets." Olivia blinked, overwhelmed by his casual generosity. "I don't know how to repay you," she admitted. "Don't worry about it," Nate replied. "You can pay me back by helping with something. I'm terrible at technology. My woodworking business could use some marketing help. Social media and all that." Olivia smiled for the first time in days. "Deal." Over the next few days, Nate became a constant presence at the house. He arrived every morning with his tool belt slung over his shoulder, a cheerful whistle announcing his arrival. Together, they tackled the most urgent repairs, patching the sagging roof, replacing broken windows, and reinforcing the creaking porch steps. Olivia quickly learned that manual labor was not her strong suit. By midday, her arms ached, and her hair was streaked with dirt. But Nate's easygoing demeanor kept her motivated. He shared stories about the town's quirks and history, making her laugh despite the challenges. Max, ever the loyal companion, supervised from the yard, wagging his tail enthusiastically whenever Nate fed him scraps from his lunch. One afternoon, while Nate was installing new shingles on the roof, Olivia ventured into her grandmother's bedroom. She hadn't stepped inside since arriving, reluctant to confront the memories it held. The room was just as she remembered. A floral quilt draped over the bed, framed photographs on the dresser, and the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. As Olivia dusted the dresser, she discovered a small leather-bound journal tucked between two old books. Curious, she opened it and recognized her grandmother's handwriting. April 3rd, 1997. "The roof is leaking again, but Nate came by to fix it. Such a sweet boy, always polite. I wish Olivia could meet someone like him someday." Olivia's breath caught as she read the entry. Her grandmother had always believed in silver linings, even in the midst of hardship. The journal was filled with similar entries, each one a testament to her resilience and gratitude. Holding the journal close, Olivia felt a spark of determination. If her grandmother could weather storms with grace, so could she. The next morning, Olivia brought Nate a cup of coffee as he worked on the front porch railing. "I found this in my grandmother's room," she said, holding up the journal. "She wrote about you." Nate laughed, a faint blush creeping up his cheeks. "She was a good woman, always made me feel like I mattered." "She thought the same about you," Olivia said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Olivia felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or the beginning of trust. Later that day, Nate introduced Olivia to the local hardware store owner, Jake, who generously offered her a discount on supplies. Jake, a burly man with a booming laugh, insisted on delivering the materials himself, refusing to take no for an answer. "You're one of us now," he said, grinning. Cedar Hill looks out for its own. The unexpected kindness brought tears to Olivia's eyes. She had spent so long guarding her heart, bracing for disappointment, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. As the weeks passed, the house slowly began to transform. The peeling paint was replaced with a fresh coat of white. The sagging roof stood firm, and the once overgrown yard was cleared to reveal a charming garden plot. Olivia worked tirelessly, often collapsing in a bed at night with aching muscles, but a renewed sense of purpose. In return, she revitalized Nate's business with a sleek new website and social media accounts. Orders poured in, and Nate joked that he might need to hire an assistant soon. "You've got a knack for this," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, sipping lemonade. Olivia smiled, looking out at the sunset. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Maybe," she said, "I'm starting to figure things out." Max barked in agreement, wagging his tail as if to say he believed in her too. The morning light spilled over the freshly painted walls of the house, making the once dreary space feel alive again. Olivia stood in the kitchen, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her grandmother's leather journal. The entry she had read so far offered a glimpse into a life filled with quiet perseverance and deep love for this little house and the Cedar Hill community. Max lay sprawled at her feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor as if urging her to read more. "All right, boy," Olivia murmured, flipping to the next page. June 15th, 1998. They're starting to talk about shutting down the old community garden. It breaks my heart to think about it. The garden has always been more than just a place to grow food. It's where we've celebrated weddings, mourned our losses, and helped each other through hard times. If I had the money, I'd save it myself. Maybe there's another way. The words tugged at Olivia's heart. She remembered faintly visiting the garden as a child, a lush space brimming with sunflowers, tomatoes, and laughter. She wondered what had become of it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Nate stood on the porch, holding a basket filled with fresh apples and a loaf of bread. "Alice sent these over," he said with a smile. "She insisted I bring them by." Olivia smiled back, her chest warming at the thoughtfulness. "Tell her thank you. I'll have to stop by and see her soon." "You should. She'd love that," Nate said. He glanced at the journal in Olivia's hand. "Found something interesting?" She hesitated for a moment before holding it out. "It's my grandmother's journal. She wrote a lot about the town and the old community garden." Nate's expression softened. "Ah, the garden? That place was something special. It's been abandoned for years now, overrun with weeds. Shame, really." Olivia's curiosity piqued. "Do you think it could ever be brought back?" "Maybe," Nate said, rubbing the back of his neck. "It'd take a lot of work, but anything's possible." "Why do you ask?" Olivia glanced down at the journal. "It just seems like something worth saving." That afternoon, Olivia decided to visit Alice, the retired schoolteacher Nate had mentioned. She found the elderly woman sitting on her porch, knitting a colorful blanket. "Olivia, dear," Alice exclaimed, her wrinkled face lighting up with delight. "Come on up. I've been hoping you'd stop by." As Olivia sat down, Alice launched into stories about her grandmother, describing her as a kind, determined woman who was always helping others. "She had a way of bringing people together," Alice said fondly. "The garden was her pride and joy. She rallied the whole town to keep it going as long as she could. I suppose that's where you get it from." "Get what from?" Olivia asked, tilting her head. "That spark," Alice said, her eyes twinkling. "You've got the same determination she had." The compliment caught Olivia off guard, but she felt a small flicker of pride. Maybe she wasn't as lost as she thought. Before Olivia left, Alice handed her a faded photograph. It showed a group of townspeople standing in the garden, smiling proudly amidst rows of blooming flowers. At the center of the group was her grandmother, her hands dirt-streaked, but her smile radiant. Inspired by the stories, Olivia decided to visit the site of the old garden. Nate offered to take her there, and together they walked down a dirt path on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, Olivia felt a pang of sadness. The once vibrant garden was now little more than a field of overgrown weeds and tangled vines. Rusted tools lay scattered among the debris, and the faded sign at the entrance read, "Cedar Hill Community Garden growing together since 1975. "It's worse than I imagined," Olivia said softly. Nate nodded. "Yeah, but it's not beyond saving. With some elbow grease, it could look like it used to." Olivia knelt down, pulling a stray sunflower seedling from the weeds. "I think I want to try." Nate's eyes met hers, his expression a mix of admiration and encouragement. "If anyone can do it, you can." Over the next week, Olivia threw herself into the project. She spent hours at the garden, clearing weeds and salvaging what she could of the old tools. Nate stopped by often to lend a hand, and even Alice came out one afternoon, bringing lemonade and stories about the garden's heyday. As word spread, other townspeople began to pitch in. Jake showed up with a truckload of fresh soil, and a group of teenagers volunteered to repaint the garden sign. Olivia was touched by their willingness to help, each act of kindness reinforcing her belief in the power of community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Olivia sat on the garden's edge, her hands sore and dirt-streaked. Max lay beside her, his tail wagging lazily. Nate approached, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," he said, handing her a mug. Thanks, Olivia said, taking a sip. The warmth seeped through her, chasing away the chill of the evening air. You've done a lot here, Nate said, gesturing to the cleared rows and freshly tilled soil. Your grandmother would be proud. Olivia smiled, her chest swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without everyone's help. It's amazing how people come together when you least expect it. Nate nodded. That's Cedar Hill for you. Folks may not have much, but they give what they can. They sat in comfortable silence, the distant hum of crickets filling the air. For the first time in months, Olivia felt a sense of peace. Do you think it's possible to rebuild something from nothing? She asked quietly. Nate glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. I think sometimes it's the only way to build something worth keeping. His words stayed with Olivia long after he left. Later that night, Olivia returned to the house and climbed up to the attic, spurred by a sudden urge to explore. She rummaged through boxes of old keepsakes until she found an ornate wooden chest. Its brass keyhole gleamed in the dim light. Remembering the key she had found tucked in her grandmother's journal, Olivia retrieved it from her pocket and slid it into the lock. The chest opened with a soft creak, revealing a collection of letters, deeds, and photographs. One document caught her eye, a property deed for an adjoining plot of land, marked Community Development Expansion Area. Her grandmother's vision for the garden had been larger than Olivia ever realized. The following morning, Olivia sat at the kitchen table, the faded deed spread out before her. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, as if sensing her unease. The adjoining plot of land described in the document was substantial, nearly double the size of the existing garden. Her grandmother had clearly dreamed big, but Olivia wasn't sure if she could follow through. This isn't just about clearing weeds anymore, Max, she said, running her fingers over the old parchment. It's about building something lasting. Her thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of thunder in the distance. She glanced out the window and saw dark clouds rolling in, casting an ominous shadow over Cedar Hill. By midday, the storm was in full swing. Sheets of rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees, bending them nearly to the ground. Olivia checked the house anxiously, relieved that Nate's repairs had fortified the roof and windows. Then she thought of the garden. Grabbing her raincoat, she rushed outside, Max following close behind. The walk to the garden was a battle against the elements. By the time she arrived, her boots were soaked, and her coat clung to her like a second skin. The storm had already begun to undo their hard work. Rows of freshly tilled soil had turned into muddy rivulets, and the garden sign Jake's team had painted now lay face down in a puddle. Olivia's heart sank. She bent down to prop up the sign, the cold rain stinging her face. As she worked, a truck's headlights cut through the downpour. Nate stepped out, pulling his hood over his head. I figured you'd be here, he called over the roar of the wind. Olivia gave him a weary smile. I couldn't just let it all wash away. Neither could I, Nate said, grabbing a tarp from his truck. Together, they worked to secure the remaining tools and protect the rows that hadn't been completely flooded. By the time the storm began to ease, Olivia's hands were numb and her muscles ached. But standing in the muddy garden with Nate beside her, she felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Thanks for coming, she said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. Always, Nate replied. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and the sky a brilliant blue. Olivia returned to the garden, expecting to find total devastation. Instead, she found Jake and a group of volunteers already hard at work repairing the damage. Morning, Olivia, Jake called, wiping sweat from his brow. We figured you could use a hand. Olivia stared at the group in disbelief. Teenagers were replanting the overturned rows, while Alice directed them with the precision of a general. Nate was fixing the sign, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and a few others were spreading fresh soil. I don't know what to say, Olivia said, her voice thick with emotion. You don't have to say anything, Alice replied. This garden belongs to all of us. Your grandmother believed that, and so do we. As Olivia joined them, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The community's kindness was unexpected but unwavering, and it reignited her determination to see the garden thrive. That evening, Olivia returned to the attic, drawn once again to the chest of documents. She sifted through the papers until she found a letter addressed to her grandmother. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were clear. Dear Eleanor, your vision for the community garden is inspiring. I've included a draft proposal for expanding the garden to include a market space where locals can sell their produce. Let me know what you think. Yours, Thomas. Olivia read the letter twice, her heart racing. A market spaces? The idea felt bold, but it could provide a sustainable future for the garden and the community. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She needed to speak to Nate. The next day, Olivia found Nate in his workshop, sanding the edge of a handcrafted table. The smell of sawdust and varnish filled the air, a comforting contrast to the storm's chaos. Got a minute? She asked. For you? Always, Nate replied, setting down his tools. Olivia pulled out the letter and handed it to him. I found this in the attic. It's a letter to my grandmother about expanding the garden into a market space. Do you think it's possible? Nate read the letter, his expression thoughtful. It's ambitious, he said, but with the right support, I think it could work. We need to rally the community, though. Olivia nodded. I think they'd get behind it. The way everyone came together after the storm, it reminded me of why this garden matters. Nate smiled. Then let's do it. We'll need to talk to the town council and get their approval. But I'm in. Over the next week, Olivia and Nate worked tirelessly to draft a proposal for the town council. They outlined plans for the market space, including stalls for produce, handmade goods, and baked treats. Olivia used her design skills to create mock-ups, while Nate reached out to locals for their support. The response was overwhelming. Alice offered to speak on behalf of the older residents, and Jake promised to donate materials for the construction. Even the teenagers who had helped after the storm volunteered to spread the word on social media. When the day of the town council meeting arrived, Olivia stood before the small panel, her heart pounding. She presented the proposal with Nate by her side, her voice steady despite her nerves. The council deliberated for what felt like an eternity before the chairman finally spoke. Miss Bennett, he said, your grandmother would be proud. The town council approves your proposal for the Cedar Hill Community Market. Cheers erupted from the audience, and Olivia felt tears well up in her eyes. That night, Olivia stood in the garden, now illuminated by strings of twinkling lights Nate had hung to celebrate. Max lay at her feet, his tail wagging lazily as if he understood the importance of the moment. Your grandmother knew this place was special, Nate said, standing beside her. Olivia nodded, her gaze fixed on the rows of freshly planted seeds. She believed in this town, and now I do too. Nate smiled, his hand brushing hers lightly. It's good to have you here, Olivia. It's good to be here, she replied, feeling for the first time in years that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The garden was coming to life again. Rows of fresh soil sprouted green shoots. The repainted sign gleamed in the sunlight, and the air buzzed with the chatter of volunteers. Olivia stood at the edge of the garden, clipboard in hand, jotting down tasks for the week ahead. She had thrown herself completely into the garden and market project, her days filled with planting schedules, supply orders, and conversations with the townspeople. Each small success felt like a step towards something meaningful, a way to honor her grandmother's legacy and carve out her place in Cedar Hill. But not everyone shared her enthusiasm. That garden is fine the way it is, grumbled Howard McKinney, a longtime resident of Cedar Hill, as he leaned on the counter at the diner. We don't need some fancy market ruining things. Olivia overheard his comment as she sat in a booth with Nate, sipping her coffee. She felt her stomach tighten, but kept her gaze on her mug. Howard's always been stuck in his ways, Nate said softly, noticing her reaction. Don't let him get to you. I'm trying, Olivia replied. But it's hard not to take it personally. Nate leaned forward, his voice steady. You've done more for that garden in a few weeks than anyone has in years. Focus on the people who believe in you. Howard will come around, or he won't. Either way, this project is worth it. His words steadied her, and she nodded. You're right. Thanks, Nate. Later that day, Olivia returned to the garden, where a group of teenagers was assembling wooden stalls for the market. Jake supervised, his booming laughter carrying across the field as he shared a joke with the kids. "Looking good, everyone," Olivia called out, her spirits lifting at the sight of their progress. Alice waved her over from the corner of the garden, where she was sorting through a stack of seed packets. "How are you holding up, dear?" the older woman asked, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Better, thanks to all of you," Olivia said, glancing around at the bustling scene. "It's amazing to see everyone coming together." Alice patted her arm. "Your grandmother would be so proud. She always said this town was at its best when folks worked side by side." The reminder of her grandmother's faith in the community bolstered Olivia's resolve. As the week went on, the market space began to take shape. The wooden stalls were painted in cheerful colors, and Nate installed sturdy benches along the edges of the garden for visitors to sit and enjoy the view. Olivia spent her evenings designing flyers to advertise the grand opening, her creative energy flowing in a way it hadn't since she lost her job in the city. But despite the progress, doubts lingered in her mind. Howard's grumbling at the diner wasn't the only resistance she had encountered. A few other residents had expressed skepticism about the project, questioning whether the market would succeed or if it was even necessary. One evening, as Olivia packed up her tools for the day, Nate approached with a thoughtful expression. "You've been quiet today," he said, leaning against the side of the garden shed. "Just thinking," Olivia admitted. "What if they're right? What if this doesn't work?" Nate crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "Olivia, when you first got here, this place was a mess. Look at it now. You've already made a difference. Whether the market becomes a huge success or not, you're building something that matters." His confidence in her was like a balm, soothing her doubts. "Thanks, Nate. I needed to hear that." The following morning, Olivia received an unexpected visitor. Clara Jenkins, a retired baker who had lived in Cedar Hill for decades, showed up at the garden carrying a box of fresh pastries. "I heard you're starting a market," Clara said, setting the box on one of the new stalls. "I'd like to sell my baked goods there. The town's been asking for my peach cobbler for years." Olivia's face lit up. "That would be wonderful, Clara." "Thank you." Clara smiled. "I've always believed in this town. And I believe in what you're doing, Olivia. Let me know how I can help." The support from someone as respected as Clara felt like a turning point. As word spread about Clara's involvement, more locals began expressing interest in participating in the market. By the time the weekend arrived, the garden was buzzing with activity. Nate had installed a chalkboard near the entrance, where Olivia wrote "Grand Opening, Coming Soon" in bold letters. Volunteers worked on the final touches, and a sense of excitement filled the air. That evening, as Olivia sat on the porch with Max, she reflected on how far they had come. The garden was more than just a plot of land now. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together. Max nudged her hand, his tail wagging, and she scratched behind his ears. "We're going to make this work," she told him. The next morning, Olivia woke to find a note taped to her front door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and her heart raced as she unfolded it. "You're wasting your time. Cedar Hill doesn't need your market. Go back to the city where you belong." Olivia's hands shook as she read the note. Anger and hurt warred within her, but she refused to let the words defeat her. She carried the note to the garden, where Nate and Jake were setting up a delivery of fresh soil. When Nate saw her face, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" he asked. Olivia handed him the note, and his jaw tightened as he read it. "Who would do this?" "I don't know," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "But I won't let them stop me." Nate's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone. We're with you." His words steadied her, and she squared her shoulders. The garden and the market were too important to abandon now. That evening, Olivia attended a town hall meeting to address any lingering concerns about the market. She stood at the front of the room, her palms damp with nervousness, and explained her vision for the project. "Cedar Hill has always been a place where people come together to support each other," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "This market isn't just about selling produce or baked goods. It's about creating a space where we can connect, share, and grow as a community." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Clara stood up, her voice clear and strong. "I believe in this market. and I believe in Olivia." One by one, others voiced their support, until the room was filled with applause. Olivia's chest swelled with gratitude, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged in Cedar Hill. The applause from the town hall meeting still echoed in Olivia's mind the next morning as she stood at the edge of the garden, gazing at the freshly painted stalls. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Hill, she felt a true sense of belonging. The community's support was a beacon, cutting through the doubts that had threatened to overshadow her progress. But as the morning sun climbed higher, Olivia couldn't shake the unease left by the anonymous note she had found on her door. It was a reminder that not everyone welcomed her presence or the market project. Max barked, jolting her from her thoughts. She turned to see Nate walking toward her, his toolbox in hand. "Morning," he called out, his easy grin already lifting her spirits. "Ready to tackle the last stretch?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Olivia replied, brushing her hair back from her face. The day was spent installing a series of trellises and decorative planters around the garden's perimeter. Alice arrived with Clara in tow, carrying trays of seedlings to fill the planters. As they worked, the garden buzzed with activity, the sound of laughter and conversation mingling with the hum of cicadas in the warm afternoon air. "It's really coming together," Clara said, wiping her brow. "Your grandmother would be proud." Olivia smiled at the compliment, though her heart still carried the weight of the note. She glanced at Nate, who gave her a reassuring nod as if to remind her she wasn't alone in this. As evening fell, Olivia and Nate stayed behind to clean up the tools and pack away the supplies. The garden was quiet now, bathed in the soft glow of the string lights Nate had hung weeks earlier. "You've done something incredible here," Nate said as they sat on one of the benches, sipping water from their canteens. "I couldn't have done it without you or the others," Olivia replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "That's true," Nate said with a chuckle. "But you're the one who brought everyone together. You've got a way of inspiring people, Olivia." His words warmed her, and for a moment, the weight of the anonymous note faded. The next day, Olivia decided to investigate the plot of land her grandmother had earmarked for the market expansion. The property was located just beyond the garden, bordered by a dense grove of trees. She hadn't ventured there before, unsure of its condition, but now felt it was time to see it for herself. She took Max with her, the dog bounding happily ahead as she navigated the overgrown path. The land was wild but beautiful, with soft, rolling terrain and a small clearing in the center. Olivia could picture the market stalls and families gathering here, her grandmother's dream finally coming to life. But as she stood in the clearing, she noticed something unusual, a wooden shed partially obscured by tall grass and vines. Curious, Olivia approached the structure, her heart beating faster. The shed was weathered, its roof sagging slightly, but the door was intact. She pushed it open cautiously, revealing a cluttered interior filled with old gardening tools, wooden crates, and a dusty ledger resting on a small table. Flipping through the ledger, Olivia found handwritten notes about harvests and sales, each page a snapshot of the garden's history. One entry caught her attention. June 10th, 1998. Final harvest before garden closure. Expansion postponed indefinitely. Funds diverted to town council emergency repairs. The words lingered in her mind as she left the shed, a mixture of sadness and resolve welling within her. The garden's closure had clearly been a loss for the community, but it also revealed how deeply her grandmother had cared for Cedar Hill. When Olivia shared the discovery with Nate that evening, he listened intently, his brow furrowed. "Divert funds? That explains why the expansion never happened," he said thoughtfully. "It's frustrating," Olivia said, "but it also reminds me of why this is so important. My grandmother believed in this project, and I want to finish what she started." Nate smiled, his admiration evident. "Then we'll make it happen. Together." As the week went on, Olivia encountered both support and resistance. Clara recruited more locals to participate in the market, including a young farmer named Ben who offered fresh eggs and honey. But Howard and a handful of other skeptics continued to voice their doubts, their criticisms growing louder as the grand opening approached. One afternoon, Olivia overheard Howard speaking to a small group outside the hardware store. "This market is a waste of time," he said, his voice sharp. "Olivia doesn't belong here. She'll pack up and leave as soon as things get tough." The words stung, but Olivia refused to let them discourage her. Instead, she channeled her frustration into her work, determined to prove Howard wrong. An unexpected ally emerged later that week when Ben, the young farmer, showed up at the garden with a delivery of compost. "I heard about what Howard's been saying," Ben said as he unloaded the bags. "Don't let him get to you. Not everyone sees change as a good thing." "Thanks, Ben," Olivia said, her voice grateful. "It means a lot to have your support." Ben smiled. "You're doing something great here. The market will help a lot of people, whether Howard wants to admit it or not." His encouragement gave Olivia the boost she needed to keep going. The night before the grand opening, Olivia stood in the garden, surveying the rows of stalls and twinkling lights. The space was alive with possibility, every corner a testament to the hard work and dedication of the community. Nate joined her, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You've created something incredible," he said, handing her a mug. "We all did," Olivia replied, her voice soft with emotion. Nate smiled, his gaze steady. "Your grandmother would be proud. And so am I." Olivia felt a lump rise in her throat. For so long, she had doubted herself, questioned her place in the world. But standing here now, surrounded by the fruits of their labor, she felt a deep sense of belonging. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, we did," Nate replied. As they stood together under the lights, Olivia allowed herself to believe that the future, while uncertain, was full of promise. The morning of the grand opening dawned crisp and bright, the sky a flawless stretch of blue. Olivia arrived at the garden just as the sun crept over the horizon, bathing the space in a warm, golden glow. Max trotted beside her, tail wagging as he sniffed the freshly tilled soil. For weeks, she had poured her heart into this project, and now, as she surveyed the rows of colorful stalls and the inviting chalkboard sign at the entrance, Olivia felt a swell of pride. "Today's the day," she said softly to Max, who barked in agreement. By mid-morning, the garden was bustling with activity. Vendors set up their goods: Clara's peach cobbler, Ben's fresh eggs and honey, and Alice's hand-sewn quilts, to name a few. The air was filled with the scents of baked bread and flowers, and the sound of cheerful chatter carried through the space. Nate arrived early, carrying crates of handmade wooden signs to help guide visitors through the market. "You're really pulling this off," he said, his voice filled with admiration as he handed her a sign that read, "Fresh produce this way." Olivia grinned. "I had a lot of help." As the first wave of visitors arrived, Olivia moved from stall to stall, greeting people and checking on the vendors. The smiles and laughter around her were contagious, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. But as the crowd grew, so did the challenges. Halfway through the day, a sudden commotion near the entrance drew Olivia's attention. She hurried over to find Howard McKinney arguing with a vendor, his voice loud and accusatory. "This whole thing is a mess," Howard exclaimed, pointing a finger at a young woman selling handmade candles. "Taking up space and making noise, this isn't what Cedar Hill needs." Olivia stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Howard, if you have concerns, you can speak with me directly. But this market is here for the entire community, and I'm not going to let you disrupt it." Howard glared at her, his face red. "You think you could just waltz in here and change everything? This town doesn't need you, Olivia." The words stung, but Olivia held her ground. "Howard, I'm not here to change the town. I'm here to bring us together. If you don't want to be a part of it, that's your choice. But this market isn't going anywhere." A murmur of agreement rippled through the nearby crowd, and Howard huffed before storming off. Nate appeared at her side, his presence a steadying force. "You handled that well," he said. Olivia exhaled slowly, the tension easing from her shoulders. "I just hope he doesn't ruin the day for anyone else." As the afternoon wore on, the market hit its stride. Families strolled through the rows of stalls, children played near the planters, and the vendors reported steady sales. Clara pulled Olivia aside with a wide grin. Your grandmother would have loved this. You've made her dream come true. The words filled Olivia with a deep sense of gratitude. She looked around at the vibrant scene, her heart swelling with pride. As evening approached, Olivia gathered everyone near the garden's entrance. The sky had softened to shades of orange and pink, and the air was thick with anticipation. I want to thank each and every one of you for making today such a success, Olivia said, her voice carrying over the crowd. This market is more than just a place to buy and sell. It's a reminder of what we can accomplish when we come together as a community. Applause erupted, and Olivia felt a lump rise in her throat. She wasn't sure how to put into words the gratitude she felt for the town that had embraced her and her grandmother's vision. Alice stepped forward, a twinkle in her eye. There's one more thing, Olivia. Tonight's the Lantern Walk. Your grandmother always said it was her favorite tradition, and it's time you experienced it for yourself. The Lantern Walk? Olivia asked, her curiosity piqued. Alice nodded. We light lanterns and walk the garden's perimeter, reflecting on the past and looking toward the future. It's our way of honoring what we've built and what's to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the townspeople gathered with lanterns in hand, their soft glow illuminating the garden. Olivia held a lantern Nate had given her, its warm light casting a golden hue across her face. The group began to walk in a slow procession around the garden's edge, the silence broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant chirp of crickets. Olivia felt a profound sense of peace as she walked, her thoughts turning to her grandmother and the legacy she had left behind. When the walk ended, the group gathered in the clearing, their lanterns casting a beautiful mosaic of light and shadow across the space. Alice spoke first. This garden has seen its share of storms, but tonight, it feels more alive than ever. Olivia, you've given us more than a market, you've reminded us of who we are. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as the crowd murmured their agreement. Thank you, Olivia said, her voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have done this without all of you. My grandmother always believed in this town, and now so do I. As the townspeople dispersed, Olivia remained in the clearing, her lantern still glowing softly. Nate joined her, his hands in his pockets. You did it, he said simply, his voice filled with pride. We did it, Olivia replied, meeting his gaze. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Hill, Olivia felt truly at home. The challenges she had faced, the resistance and doubts, all seemed small compared to the strength she had found in herself and the community. The Lantern Walk had illuminated more than just the garden. It had shown her the light within her own heart, a beacon that would guide her forward no matter what lay ahead. The morning after the Lantern Walk, Olivia sat on the front porch of her grandmother's house, sipping coffee as Max dozed at her feet. The glow of the previous evening lingered in her mind, and she found herself smiling as she watched the soft light of dawn spill over Cedar Hill. The grand opening had been a success beyond anything she could have imagined. Clara sold out of her baked goods, Ben's honey jars had been swept off his stall, and Alice's quilts were the talk of the town. Even the teenagers had enjoyed themselves, organizing games for the children and taking turns helping at the stalls. But it wasn't just the market that had lifted Olivia's spirits. The Lantern Walk had solidified her bond with Cedar Hill, making her feel, for the first time, like she truly belonged. She glanced down at the notepad in her lap, where she'd scribbled a list of next steps for the market, expanding the vendor lineup, promoting the event beyond Cedar Hill, and improving the paths around the garden topped her list. Max barked suddenly, breaking her train of thought. Olivia looked up to see Nate walking up the driveway, a box balanced on one shoulder. Morning, he called, his usual grin in place. Figured I'd drop these off before the heat sets in. What's this? Olivia asked, setting her coffee aside as she stood to meet him. Wood for those benches you mentioned, Nate said, setting the box down on the porch. Thought we could use a few more around the garden, maybe near the clearing. Olivia's heart warmed at his thoughtfulness. Thank you, Nate. You're always one step ahead. He shrugged, his grin widening. Just trying to keep up with you. Later that day, Olivia returned to the garden to begin organizing her plans. A steady stream of locals passed through, many stopping to congratulate her on the market's success or offer their help with future projects. Among them was Ben, who brought news that filled Olivia with cautious hope. Words spreading about the market, he said as he helped unload a bag of compost near the planter boxes. A couple of farmers from the next town over want to join. They heard about it through Jake. That's fantastic, Olivia said, feeling a spark of excitement. If we can bring in vendors from other areas, it'll make the market even more sustainable. Ben nodded. And it might convince folks like Howard that this isn't just a passing idea. It's something real. As Olivia worked, she couldn't shake the memory of Howard's words during the grand opening. His resistance still stung, though she tried to remind herself that not everyone would be on board right away. That evening, as she walked back to her house with Max trotting beside her, she found herself lost in thought. The market had been a success, but maintaining its momentum would require patience, perseverance, and a willingness to face setbacks. Her grandmother's journal, which now rested on her nightstand, had been a constant source of encouragement. In its pages, Olivia found not only her grandmother's wisdom, but also a reminder of the resilience that had shaped Cedar Hill for generations. The next morning, Olivia received an unexpected visit. Howard McKinney stood on her porch, hat in hand, his expression guarded. "Morning, Olivia," he said gruffly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Good morning," Olivia replied, her voice cautious. "What brings you here?" Howard cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a spot just beyond her shoulder. "I've been thinking about what you said at the market, about bringing folks together. I reckon I was too quick to judge." Olivia blinked, caught off guard by his admission. "I appreciate you saying that, Howard." He nodded, still avoiding her eyes. "I've got a small orchard out back, peach mostly. Figured I could bring some to the next market, if you'll have me." A smile spread across Olivia's face, her earlier doubts melting away. "We'd love to have you, Howard." "Thank you." He gave a short nod and turned to leave, but not before mumbling, "You're doing good work, Olivia. Your grandmother would be proud." Howard's involvement marked a turning point. His reputation in Cedar Hill carried weight, and his decision to support the market swayed others who had been hesitant. In the weeks that followed, the market grew steadily. New vendors joined, bringing fresh produce, handmade crafts, and even live music to the garden. Visitors came from neighboring towns, drawn by word of mouth and the inviting atmosphere. Olivia found herself busier than ever, coordinating schedules, designing flyers, and fielding calls from interested vendors. But the work was rewarding, each small victory reinforcing her commitment to the project. One evening, as Olivia and Nate sat in the clearing, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she reflected on how far they had come. "This place feels different now," she said, her voice soft. Nate nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not just the garden. You've brought new life to the whole town." Olivia smiled, her chest swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you and everyone else." "You're the heart of it, Olivia," Nate said, his voice steady. "Your grandmother started something special, but you've carried it forward." As the stars began to appear, Olivia felt a profound sense of peace. The challenges she had faced, the doubts, the resistance, the long hours had been worth it. Cedar Hill was no longer just her grandmother's town. It was her home. And with each passing day, Olivia felt more certain that she had found her purpose not just in the garden or the market, but in the connections she had built with the people around her. For the first time in years, she felt truly rooted. The following week brought an unexpected twist to Olivia's life. The market was thriving, with visitors spilling through the garden each weekend. Clara's peach cobblers were now a local legend, and even Howard's peaches had developed a loyal following. Word of the Cedar Hill Community Market had spread farther than Olivia had imagined, drawing curious visitors from nearby towns. Yet, amid the buzz of success, Olivia's past reappeared in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was busy arranging a display of fresh-cut flowers near the garden's entrance when she heard someone call her name. The voice was familiar, sharp and clear, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Olivia!" She turned slowly, her heart thudding. Standing at the gate was Ethan, her ex-fiancé, dressed in an immaculate suit that seemed comically out of place against the rustic backdrop of the garden. "What are you doing here?" Olivia asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions rising within her. I came to see you, Ethan replied, stepping closer. His gaze swept over the garden before landing back on her. I heard about everything you're doing here. It's impressive. Olivia crossed her arms, a barrier between them. You didn't answer my question. Why are you here? Ethan hesitated, then sighed. I made a mistake, Olivia. I thought I wanted something else, but I was wrong. Leaving you was the worst decision I ever made. Olivia stared at him, her mind flashing back to the night she'd discovered his betrayal. The hurt, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, it all came rushing back. You think you could just show up here, after everything, and expect me to what? Forgive you. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Ethan said quickly. I'm asking for another chance. We were good together, Olivia. We could be again. Nate, who had been repairing a stall nearby, approached cautiously. He looked between Olivia and Ethan, his expression unreadable. Everything okay here? Nate asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan glanced at him, then back at Olivia. I was just leaving, he said stiffly. He turned to Olivia, his eyes softening. Think about what I said. I'll be staying in town for a few days if you want to talk. As Ethan walked away, Olivia felt Nate's steady presence beside her. You don't have to tell me anything, Nate said gently. Olivia let out a shaky breath. That was Ethan, my ex-fiancé. Nate nodded, his expression thoughtful. What does he want? To undo the past, Olivia said bitterly. But that's not how it works. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Olivia threw herself into her work, determined to push Ethan's visit from her mind. But his words lingered, dredging up emotions she had worked so hard to bury. That evening, she found herself sitting on the porch with her grandmother's journal in her lap. Flipping through its pages, she searched for the calm and clarity her grandmother's words always seemed to provide. One entry stood out. Sometimes, the past tries to follow you, like a shadow you can't shake. But the future is yours to shape, and you can only carry so much forward. Choose wisely. Olivia closed the journal, her heart steadied by the wisdom it offered. Her grandmother had faced her own share of difficulties, yet she had always moved forward with grace. Olivia realized she could do the same. The next day, Ethan showed up at the market again, lingering near the stalls, but keeping his distance. It wasn't until the crowd thinned that he approached Olivia. Can we talk? He asked, his tone softer this time. Olivia sighed. Fine, but not here. They walked to the clearing at the edge of the garden, where the sunlight filtered through the trees in dappled patterns. Olivia stopped and turned to face him, her arms crossed. Say what you need to say, Ethan. Ethan hesitated, then spoke. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve another chance. But I still love you, Olivia. I've never stopped. Olivia shook her head, her voice firm. Love isn't just words, Ethan. It's actions. And your actions made it clear where your priorities were. I've changed, Ethan insisted. I'm ready to commit to us again. But Olivia's mind was already made up. I've changed too, she said. I've built a life here, a good life. And it doesn't include you. Ethan's shoulders slumped, but he nodded. I understand. I wanted you to know how I feel. Now you do, Olivia said, her voice steady. Goodbye, Ethan. As she walked away, Olivia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she truly felt free from the pain of her past. When she returned to the garden, Nate was waiting for her near the planters. Everything okay? He asked, his eyes filled with quiet concern. Yeah, Olivia said, her voice lighter than it had been in years. I think it is. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the soft rustle of leaves around them. Then Nate spoke, his tone hesitant but hopeful. I care about you, Olivia, he said, his gaze steady. More than I realized at first. I just want you to know that. Olivia felt her heart swell, a warmth spreading through her chest. I care about you too, Nate. More than I've let myself admit. He smiled, and in that moment, Olivia felt like the world had shifted in the best possible way. That evening, as the stars began to dot the sky, Olivia sat on the porch with Max at her feet. The garden was quiet now, the market stalls empty, but ready for the next weekend. Her life had changed so much in the past few months, and though the road hadn't been easy, She was grateful for every step that had brought her here. Cedar Hill was no longer just a refuge. It was her home, a place where she had found purpose, connection, and the courage to move forward. And for the first time in a long while, Olivia looked to the future with nothing but hope. The morning after her conversation with Nate, Olivia felt lighter, as if the weight of her past had finally been lifted. The sun rose over Cedar Hill, casting a golden glow across the garden. The stalls stood ready for another weekend market, and the familiar hum of activity was already starting to fill the air. Olivia carried a basket of fresh herbs to Clara's stall, greeting visitors and vendors as she went. There was a sense of joy in the air, a reflection of the community they had built together. As she arranged the herbs neatly on Clara's table, Howard McKinney approached with a small crate of peaches. "Morning, Olivia," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly. I thought you might like these. Best ones I've had in years." Olivia smiled warmly, accepting the crate. "Thank you, Howard. That means a lot." Howard tipped his hat and wandered off, muttering something about needing to check his stall. Olivia couldn't help but chuckle, touched by his subtle gesture of support. By mid-afternoon, the market was buzzing with activity. Families browsed the stalls, children played near the garden's edge, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Olivia moved through the crowd, chatting with visitors and checking in with vendors. As the day wound down, Alice called Olivia over to a table near the clearing. "Sit down, dear," Alice said, gesturing to an empty chair. Clara and Jake were already seated, their expressions warm but serious. "What's going on?" Olivia asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Alice reached for Olivia's hand, her eyes twinkling. "We've been talking, and we think it's time you take on an official role here in Cedar Hill. You've done so much for the town, and we want to make sure you know how much we value you." Clara nodded. The garden and the market, they're more than just projects. They've brought people together in a way we haven't seen in years. "That's because of you, Olivia." Jake leaned forward, his voice steady. "We want to nominate you to join the town council. We could use someone with your vision and drive." Olivia's eyes widened in surprise. "The town council? I don't know. I've only been here a few months." "Exactly," Alice said with a smile. "And in those few months, you've accomplished more than most of us have in years." Olivia spent the evening mulling over their proposal. Sitting on her porch with Max at her feet, she thought about how far she had come since arriving in Cedar Hill. The idea of joining the town council was daunting, but it also felt like a natural next step in her journey. When Nate arrived later that night, she shared the news with him. "They want me to join the town council," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That doesn't surprise me," Nate replied, his smile reassuring. "You've earned their trust, Olivia, and you've shown everyone what's possible when we work together." "Do you think I can do it?" "I know you can," Nate said, his gaze steady. "You've already proven that." The next week brought new challenges and opportunities. Olivia accepted the nomination, and the town council wasted no time putting her to work. She quickly became involved in discussions about expanding the market's reach and finding ways to improve the town's infrastructure. At the same time, the garden continued to thrive. Olivia and Nate worked on building additional stalls, while Alice led a group of volunteers in planting a new section of wildflowers near the clearing. The market's success inspired other projects, too. Jake offered to organize a monthly craft fair, and Ben started teaching local kids how to care for the bees on his farm. Cedar Hill was buzzing with activity, and Olivia felt a deep sense of pride in being part of it. One evening, as Olivia and Nate sat on a bench near the garden's edge, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "I've been thinking about this for a while," Nate said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Olivia's heart skipped a beat as he opened the box, revealing a simple but beautiful silver ring. "I know your life has been turned upside down this past year," Nate continued, "but I think you found something special here. And I know I have too. Olivia, will you marry me?" Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she looked at him, her heart full. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their engagement became the talk of the town, and the news seemed to bring even more life to Cedar Hill. The market's grand reopening the following weekend was a celebration of both their love and the community's resilience. As Olivia stood in the garden, watching the bustling market and the smiling faces around her, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Cedar Hill had given her more than a home. It had given her a purpose, a family, and a future filled with hope. That night, as the stars glittered above the garden, Olivia reflected on everything that had brought her to this moment. The pain of losing her job, the heartbreak of Ethan's betrayal, the fear of starting over, it had all led her here. And here in Cedar Hill, she had found more than she ever thought possible. The future wasn't something to fear anymore. It was something to embrace, one beautiful moment at a time. If you enjoyed Olivia's journey and want to follow more heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Let us know what part of her story inspired you most. Your support helps bring more stories to life.